Hello. Thanks for joining us for episode 5 of the Elation Hour. We're back on our tools and techniques track. And today we're going to be talking about theatrical and operatic lighting. As always, I'm joined by Matthias Heinrichs. Hi, Matthias.
Hey there. Good morning, John.
Additionally, we have the biggest number of guests we've ever had, actually. Multi-award winning lighting designers, including Jeff Croiter. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, John.
John.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, John.
Hey, everybody.
Bradley King.
Afternoon, everyone.
And Jason Lyons.
Everyone.
One little piece of business before we jump in. I just want to give a quick shout out to Jean Lerevier. Happy birthday in Austin, my friend.
Happy birthday, John. Happy birthday.
Moving along, for those people who may not have as much information on your backgrounds, why don't we start off? And Mr. Froelich, you seem to have a little bit of a different background than I think some of these guys do. So why don't you start us off and give a brief background about yourself?
Put me in the hot seat first. Okay, here's a quick rundown. Never thought I'd be in theater. Actually, at a young age in high school, I took some theater classes and really enjoyed it. But I had a passion for flying, and I got a commission to go to the United States Coast Guard Academy. So I commissioned and went into basic training and was off to be a naval architect and a marine engineer and to fly helicopters someday. And for a few reasons, most notably because the trouble with discipline and a few other things, I had to switch tracks and didn't really know what I was going to do, but I ended up in a small state school back where I grew up in Montana, University of Montana, and I fell in love with theater. And after that, after 4 years there or 3.5 years there, graduated, and being in Montana and wanting to go in theater, I'm like, where do I go? So I did a United Regional Theater auditions and decided to go to graduate school at UConn. And in the first year there, I actually got picked up and selected to do an internship at the Metropolitan Opera. And before that internship ended, after a lot of hard work, they actually offered me a job. I stayed, and it wasn't in my selected field of lighting design. It was in technical direction and technical management. But I figured I was always raised, take the job that's available and work towards the one you want. And so that's what I did. And from there, I went from the Met. Then I was the TD at American Ballet Theater for roughly a year. Then I went back and worked for Local One as a layout carpenter in the shop back at the Metropolitan Opera. Then I went to London after I was recruited by English National Opera. And I was the deputy technical director there. I was there for about 3 years. And then I came back stateside after my wife and I had our kid overseas. And we kind of slowed down a bit. I thought I was going to get into teaching a little bit because I wanted to give back. Thought I had a lot of great experiences at a young age. And next thing you know, I got a call once again from the Met. They had an opening in the lighting design office. And I really, by this time, it had been about 10, 11 years. I was totally out of the specialty of lighting design. I was like, you know, what's special about me? And they said, listen, you've always worked hard for us. It's a tough place, you know it, and we need you back. So I went back. I started as an assistant. I did 2 years roughly as an assistant, and then they selected me for resident lighting designer. And I've been there, resident lighting designer, since 2011, 2012. So that's the whole thing.
Wow. It's quite the story, actually. Bradley, how about you? Go back.
My story is not nearly as interesting and probably far more typical because, like most of you watching, or like a lot of you watching, I really wanted to be an actor when I was in high school. So I did all the plays. I did Baker and Into the Woods. I was Prince Dauntless and Once Upon a Mattress. And so I, towards the end of my time in high school, I had some friends who were writing plays, and I directed a couple of them. I was like, wow, I really like this directing thing. So where I go to school, I want to make sure that there's an acting program and a directing program. And so I ended up going to NYU for undergrad as an actor-director, and then very quickly switched over to just directing because I thought acting was for suckers. Directors were the ones in charge. And then about 2 years into my directing training, I realized that everyone's always looking to the directors for the answers to everything, and I didn't really like being on the hot seat all that time. And as it turned out, like as part of my program, I got to direct one show, but I had 15 classmates all also directing shows, and they all needed design teams. And I had done all the things in high school. I had done lights, I had done sound, I had sewed costumes, I had built scenery. So someone asked, "Hey, would you do lights for my show week 1?" And then I did lights week 1, and then week 3, and then week 5, 6, 7, and like before I knew it, a semester had gone by, and I designed like a dozen 30-minute plays. So towards the end of my time at NYU undergrad, I started slowly shifting over to doing lighting more full time. Ended up with a fantastic internship at Seattle Repertory Theater about 15 years ago. I had a great mentor there, L.B. Morse, who I think is still their resident, now more the resident designer. At the time, he was resident associate. And through that internship, I met people like Hal Binkley and Jane Cox and Scott Zielinski and Don Holder, and all of these, because it was a pure design internship. It was not an electrics internship. I was at the tech table with these fabulous designers, all of whom I hounded persistently when I got back to New York at the end of my internship. And that turned into a kind of long-term relationship with Jane Cox and Hal Binkley, where I was able to subsist on an assistant career for a couple of years before I decided I was ready to go back to grad school. Went back to NYU, mainly to study with Robert Wurzel and John Conklin, and then continued my sort of freelance assisting career, designing my smaller shows, making my money assisting on the bigger ones until finally, I was able to build a sustainable freelance career. And that's my 3-minute story.
Amazing. Lots of work in there. Jason, how about you?
Very similar to Bradley in a lot of ways, including that I also played the baker in Into the Woods, Bradley. So at some point we'll have to reminisce about that. But yeah, I started off as being interested in acting, and I did all of the shows in high school in the same way. And while I was in high school, I had the theater director there was working at a summer stock theater, and asked if I wanted to come and intern over the summer. So starting my freshman year in high school, I started interning at a summer stock theater, and I worked there pretty much all through high school. And I was doing everything. I was a carpenter. I worked in the costume shop a little bit, painter, and then I started doing lighting, and just kind of fell in love with what I was seeing. I was lucky enough to work with some really interesting designers, and they created really, really beautiful work that constantly, I was amazed by how moved the audiences were by moments that weren't necessarily scripted or, part of what people would normally realize. So that got me really excited to be a part of something in a way that made people feel things. I was really pumped by that. So I decided to go to college for it, and I ended up going to SUNY Purchase, and I studied under Bill Mintzer and Brian McDevitt there, and just had an amazing time in terms of the kind of work that we were able to do and the kind of classwork we were able to do, and then the internships that we were able to take part of. While I was there, I interned with Ken Billington, who I then ended up working for a couple of years on and off, and then with Brian McDevitt. And I graduated and kind of went right into Brian's studio and did just dozens and dozens of shows every year with Brian for probably like 6 or 7 years. And all the while trying to keep up on my own work and pick up whatever design opportunities I could until I was able to kind of make that shift and switch into just designing. And I've spent many years doing that. And I briefly taught at Purchase. And now, after years of not teaching, I've kind of come back to teaching again. I'm now teaching at College of Charleston. While bouncing around the country, continuing to light things.
Fantastic. Certainly not least, Jeff, how about a little background on yourself?
I'm a lighting designer.
I love it.
So similar to Jason Bradley, I still a little bit of acting, but realized very quickly that I was stage fright by, a group of more than 5 or 10 people. But what I did do when I was younger, performing wise, I played in bands, and I thought maybe that I'd be a rock star someday, but ended up not doing that. I actually was the president of the drama club in my high school, so interested in producing and directing and kind of all aspects of it, and worked in lighting as well in high school. And my parents were both involved in the local theater. So when they would do shows, I would always be around doing something. Even from when I was from when I could barely walk, I was in a theater with them, moving props around, painting something, hanging lights. And it was an internship. I did an internship in high school at Summer Stock Theater, and kind of fell in love with lighting during that summer. I worked with some people that were true professionals, and I didn't, I sort of knew what that was, but then being immersed in it and spending a summer with people who did it for a living made me sort of realize that it was something that someone could do. And I started enjoying how lighting can help tell a story and be part of the process. So I also went to Purchase, and I studied with Bill Menser and Brian McDevitt, just like Jason. And I got out of Purchase, and I did the Hemsley internship 100 years ago. And then assisted for years. And again, assisted for 7 or 8 years while I was doing smaller shows, meeting people. And actually, back then, I started working with the Jennifer Muller Dance Company. So while I was assisting and doing small theater shows, I was working with Jennifer Muller and running all over the world with her, because she was at that time touring all over the world. I spent, I did lighting in Siberia and in, far-flung places all over. Didn't know that we were going to Siberia, actually. We thought we were going to be around Moscow, and then we got on a train for 17 hours, but that's a whole other story. So I danced some opera, but not very much. I currently designing the new Penn and Teller show in Vegas, but mostly theater or performance, plays, musicals, performance. A couple of years of circus, but even when I was doing the circus, I was sort of jumping back and forth between the public theater and a tent at Lincoln Center. So I'm rooted in the theater. That's what I stopped assisting, I think, in 1999 or 2000. And have been doing this ever since, and I love it, and I really miss it, and I hope we get back to doing it soon.
I think that's probably a sentiment shared by everybody. It's interesting, all of you guys talk about internship programs and obviously assisting for a period of time. Let's talk about that a little bit. Those key influences, those key programs you're able to be a part of, whether that be through university or through summer stock or something else. And Bradley, why don't you give a little more insight into that? Maybe help navigate some people who are trying to get through this, who may be trying to do this for a long time.
Sure. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is there's no right way of going about this. There's no formula that you're supposed to follow. You should do the work that you find interesting. You should put yourself in the room with people you find interesting. Like one of the reasons I went to graduate school at NYU was because before I had done my internship at Seattle Rep, I did summer stock at Glimmerglass Opera, which is now Glimmerglass Festival. And the reason I ended up there was on the advice of my undergraduate lighting teacher, Lenore Doxey, who was an amazing first teacher and mentor in my career in life. And we unfortunately lost her a couple of years ago to cancer, which was a huge, huge blow to the off-Broadway community, especially. But so she pointed me towards Glimmerglass because she had worked there, and she said, I think this would be really good for you. And that's where I met Robert Rosell. That's where I saw the work of people like John Conklin and Paul Steinberg. And I said, oh, these are all people who are teaching at NYU. That's where I want to go learn. And, John doesn't teach lighting. He teaches a class at the time it was called Confound, where he just sort of held court on whatever he found interesting for that day. And that was one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had, was just going to class with John Conklin and having him talk at you for 3 hours every week. So, research people as opposed to programs, I think, is really important. And, see a lot of work, participate in a lot of work. At some point, you're going to have to make decisions about how you're going to support yourself, and you're going to have bills to pay. Frequently, assisting pays a lot better than designing. Just because you'll be assisting on larger shows than you're designing at your own time, and maybe your $500 design fee turns into like a $2,500 assistant fee. So that's a trade-off. Graduate school, you have to know why you're going to graduate school before you even think about applying. Because if you're just sort of blindly going to a graduate program, like, oh, this is what I'm supposed to do next, you're not going to know where to go. You're not going to know what it is I want out of the experience. It's a huge investment in time and money. Personally, I don't think anyone should ever pay for graduate school, especially in our field, because the return's just not going to be worth it. So these are all things to consider. But I really want to stress that there's like no one proper path. There's no one set way of going about this. It's going to be different to every individual, and your tastes are going to change. And when you're not passionate about what you're doing anymore, find something else, because it's too much work for not enough money to do it if you don't love it.
That's some great insight. Jason, how about you?
I was just writing down, like, God, Bradley, like, nailed so many of those points. One of the great ones that I love is when you talk about going to school, about talking about looking into the people and not necessarily the programs. I feel very strongly about that the people that are teaching the classes and their aesthetic and what they bring to the table is so important. One of the biggest questions, or the most frequent questions I get from students, whether it was when I was teaching at Purchase or now at College of Charleston, is, oh, what kind of gear do you have at the college? Like, what am I going to learn how to use? And I get a little hesitant to even talk about that. Because neither Purchase nor College of Charleston necessarily have like the best gear, the best inventories. But I also feel like at the college level, and when you're learning about lighting design, that's not what it's about. You really need to get into the core of what it is you're trying to do with lighting design. And to do that, you have to learn how to make choices. And you can't really work on making choices if you have a million colors at your disposal. You have to actually be able to sit there and choose what one color you want to use for what one moment you're creating. So I that is something that I feel kind of strongly about, is like, don't get wrapped up in the gear early on. Yes, it's important to understand the tools that are available, but get the design base first, because that will serve you no matter what happens with the gear down the line, because it's all constantly evolving. And the other one that Bradley brought up is like, if you're doing something and you realize that you don't love it anymore, find something else to do. It's a big one that I feel really strongly about, because it's a tough business to be a part of normally. Put aside what we're going through right now. It's really challenging on your lives and on your family and on your friends and all of that. And the phrase that I've been using recently about that is, you have to love it, but you have to also remember that the business isn't going to love you back. So just keep that in mind as you make your choices. Like it's a lot to take on, and that doesn't mean that it isn't amazing and wonderful and we all love it, but make sure that you're able to balance that in your life. And I think everything else that you asked about, Bradley, hit the nail on the head. So I don't want to waste your time repeating it.
Perfect. Jeff, anything to add in this topic?
Well, I mean, no, I think you both said it. You're absolutely right. And I say this to students anytime anyone asks, you have to love it. And, I don't need to reiterate what you guys just said, but it's true. It's hard. There's not enough money. Even the designers who make money don't make money compared to real people. So, love it and love the people, because that's the other part of this. It's not just love what you're doing. It's a community, and that's what I love about it. I love this community, and that's why I continue to do it. It's not just that I love lighting. I do love lighting, but I also love going to work every day to work with the people that I get to do lighting with. And in terms of like how, I went to Purchase also, we're all kind of in a unique situation right now, where a lot of the lighting designers that you may want to work with are sitting at home. And so email them, and now's a great time to talk to people. because you're not gonna, you're not gonna find all of us sitting around all in one shot for, very often. And as a young designer, figure out like, what you want to, how you want to approach it and what you want to do. And you're not going to, you'll know by doing it. And I will say, like, I like to give credit to certain people. And Jason mentioned Bill Mintzer and Brian McDevitt. And, Bill Mintzer, as Bradley said about his teacher, Bill Mintzer didn't teach me how to light a play. He taught me how to read a play, and he taught me how to talk to a director, and that lighting is not.
Fortunately, we're having a little technical difficulties with Jeff. You might need to plug back in your headphones, Jeff.
How far? The whole thing?
There you go. No, just the last minute or less. Perfect.
Okay.
I can lip read. It was beautiful.
Oh, thanks. I should have a signer in the corner. I was saying, what was I saying? What's the last thing you heard me say?
The last thing when you started to break up was related to your professors and them not teaching you about lighting, teaching you about reading a play and
reading a play. Great. So great. Quickly. Bill Mintzer taught me how to read a play, and that lighting is not just technical. Brian McDevitt taught me how to see the big picture, look at the stage, and that it's not just about lighting a performer, and it's about seeing everything. And spending time working with Jeff Davis, he taught me how to organize myself in the theater and how important that is as a professional. And Ken Posner taught me, like, took everything, all of that, and showed me what a lighting designer is kind of supposed to look like and how to behave and what a great lighting designer it is. And I will say, in terms of learning, every time I work with a director or another designer, I learn something. I take something away from working with other great people in the biz.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jeff. Before I move on to John and get his insight onto this, the things that I find interesting, obviously the three of you have a relatively similar story. Going through the assisting and finding these people that were able to really influence you and learning from a performance-based perspective first and then moving into the design and those sorts of things. Obviously, that's an interesting perspective. But the one thing that's shared here with Mr. Froelich is you guys did so many different jobs. Jason mentions being a carpenter as well. And I was a director for Bradley and you did all these other things, Jeff. So John, why don't you kind of bring us into that with that shared perspective like you said, do what you got to do until you get to where you want to be.
Yeah. But first off, I 100% agree with everybody who's already spoken. I think it's the most important thing is, as someone I was talking to the other day, is that this is a family feeling business, but it's still a business. And the biggest thing I could say, if you want to just put it in a sentence, is that if you can imagine yourself doing anything else, do that. Because this is long, it's hard, as everybody else already said, Bradley, Jeff, like, we make pennies compared to the effort that other people put into their jobs. And I know that's a generalization, but I just want to put it out there. That said, we're all here, we're all passionate. I love the collaboration. But now just to get to the story, I came from a small town in Montana. My family didn't have a lot of money. I come from a fairly conservative family. So I'm kind of the black sheep. I'm the only male Froelich that hasn't fired a weapon in a war for the United States. So as I pursued my career in theater, I got very little financial help and very little support from an emotional and formative point of view. I was really on my own. So I had to figure it out. And being from a state that, of course, there is arts in Montana, but nothing compared to what we all do now. And I have to say that my biggest mentor was my scene design professor at the University of Montana. And like I said, it's so funny how we've all shared that there are people outside of the lighting design discipline that has really shaped our points of view, our design process, our career. And Bill Rowell was an amazing man. We, again, lost him a few years ago, but he created the stock scenery construction handbooks. I actually helped him revise the second volume. And, but just his ability to discuss things in a design way, to see the world through an artistic lens. I learned so much from him about that. And he's the one that he saw the passion in me, and he told me like so many times, just don't give up. Like I was like, oh, how am I going to pay for the next semester? I'm doing everything I can, like all the stuff. And just like, if I worked hard enough, I always found a way. And I do totally agree with what Bradley said about it is important to know what you're supposed to do or what you're supposed to get from a personal standpoint at a grad school. Unfortunately, when I graduated from undergrad, I really had no clue. Like, do I move to LA? Do I try to move to New York? I had no money. I had a beat up old Chevy Blazer and 2 duffel bags. Which direction do I go? So I did exactly what Bradley said. I found the program as close to where I wanted to end up with the people that I thought would help me the most, that was free, which was, for me, with the assistantships and stuff, was the University of Connecticut. And there I was so fortunate because it was my first year there. Jim Franklin, the lighting design professor, went on sabbatical. So I showed up and he was gone. And I was like, what am I going to do? And they hired someone to fill in for him. And it was Jeff Davis. And Jeff was another huge person in the early stages of my career to organize the artistic chaos in my head. And, in my undergraduate, we used AMX 192 data, so I was really behind the times when it came to, anything from a technological standpoint. So I developed my design skills, like everyone else here, based on really probably fairly primitive equipment. Mine was very primitive, and then I move out east. I'm like, oh, I went from a Strand light palette 90 to an Obsession, like I was just like, wow, this is amazing. So I had a lot of like technology catching up to do, but really, since, as everybody already said, since I worked so hard on the design idea, the design building blocks, my foundations, all that stuff just comes. So, and I think that's probably all I can add. Like I said, I had a different avenue, but it is important what everybody said about knowing yourself and what the next step means, and most notably how much it costs, because I think that there's some things that are quite misleading out there, especially when you get into grad school, that, and like I said, we're resources out here. Email us, call us. We're sitting at home right now, it'd be good. So that's about it.
Thanks, John. It's pretty amazing. I think the theater world, as a general statement, the willingness for, very successful designers, yourselves now included, willing to give back and participate in these programs and internships and all these other things. You don't really see that too often in some of the other genres in lighting, particularly concert touring, for instance. That was a great segue, John, into the technology portion of the world. But we had a quick question by Pierre Roy in regards to how let's do quickly because for time purposes, but what do you guys feel the difference between learning and the importance of learning in school versus like learning in real world environment? Is it 50-50? Is it 70-30? And perhaps you can give us like a percentage and in which direction? John, since you were last, want to start?
Sure. Thanks for reminding me. One thing I've totally forgot to bring up is that I was very fortunate in my undergraduate and at UConn for a brief period. They both had professional companies in residence, and that kind of opened up a lot of design opportunities, especially for me in modern dance, because they're actually in my undergrad 2 professional companies in residence. So they were looking for designers all the time. And I kind of cut my teeth in more of the professional side of it, even though it was in an academic setting. So I would say I would kind of lean towards, I would say, actual experience. And I'll say what you're asking is actually in the theater designing. I would probably put an 80% emphasis on that versus 20% like classroom and study. So that's my point of view.
Jeff.
I agree, and that's what I was going to say. 80% to 20%. I think the foundation is important. I think going to school, and I'm not someone who's like, you have to go to grad school. Actually, I don't think it's necessary unless you need it. I mean, it's like the number 2 question I get is, should I go to grad school? And my answer is always if you feel like you need more education, then go to grad school. If you feel like you know it, if you have the basis, then don't. You learn by the lighting, by lighting, and you learn your approach by doing it. Fortunately, at Purchase, there was a dance program, and I think it's organized now. But back in the day, we'd have to like sneak off and do shows with the choreographers in the dance program and use a fake name so we wouldn't get caught. But that's where that's how I learned my aesthetic, by lighting dance show after dance show after dance show in the dance theater lab. So.
Bradley, any difference there? 80-20?
I think it depends. Sorry, I think it's unique to everyone. And what do you want to do? Do you want to do plays and musicals? Then yeah, you need to go like do plays and musicals. But you also need, foundations in dramaturgy. You need to be able to talk to a director. Like I had a lot of in-theater experience thanks to those internships at Glimmerglass in Seattle, and then assisting for 2 years. I was behind a Broadway tech table when I was like 22 years old, getting to watch Hal Binkley work. So when I went back to grad school, I went because I wanted the time to spend like 4 months working on one play without having to work on anything else. And I wanted to like talk about it endlessly. Like that's what I wanted out of grad school. Not everyone wants that. Not everyone needs that. So I think it's totally dependent on what you're after, why you're going. Obviously, like you cannot design without designing. Like it's kind of like no brainer there. But also like maybe your goal isn't to be a designer. Maybe you want to be like a professional Broadway associate, of which there are many, and which is like an amazing, complicated job. Like again, I think it needs to vary a little bit based on who you are and what you want to do. And that's what I will say about that.
I like that answer. Jason.
Yeah, I have to agree. I mean, I think it does depend, and I think we've all kind of hit on the fact that the internships, that actually being in the room and seeing the designer in the moment, under pressure, in the hot seat, and understanding what that means before you're actually doing it is unbelievably helpful because. I just like a quick story from my senior year. I got to design 2 main stages my senior year, and the first one was before my internship, and I felt like I did a good job, but I was a total asshole. I was not very nice to anyone in the room, and I felt that was just the pressure of the job, and that was what I had felt like I had learned from seeing some other of my classmates design, and then I went and interned with Brian. And came back the next semester, and my next design was a completely different process. I was like, oh, you work with these people, and it's a collaboration across the board with every person in the room. And I felt like that different attitude that I was able to bring because I had that experience allowed me to do better work and allowed me to actually enjoy it more. So I think to kind of put an endpoint on all of those, like having that ability to understand what it actually means to be sitting in the theater is a huge part of being able to do it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jason.
John, can I add something quick there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Really quick, just as far as assisting and whether that's something that people can do and not, like what Bradley brought up, it is a career track. Assisting is something that people can do, and I actually don't find that there are enough. There are a lot of people who do it, but not a lot of people who do it really well at the caliber that is required. And to just piggyback on something Jason said, it's yes, you want to be the nicest person in the room. It's hard sometimes, but you also want to be the person who doesn't say no. And I think that's more important. If there's an idea, you should just get the word no out of your system. And there's always a way. Try and no. It's my least favorite words. Okay, bye.
Very good. So there was a quick question that I'll just kind of piece together from all your answers related to sticking with a genre. Obviously, I think all of these gentlemen here kind of taken the work that was available and built an aesthetic around that, switching between genres or different scenarios to build an overall look. And I think that's the answer, is really to take the jobs as they come and work your way towards what you want. Do you guys agree? You can nod on that one. All right. we've got everybody into a theater and kind of that process and some navigation there. So once you guys got on this theater, each of you sort of started at some different times and some different ways. We had Victor Fable on in the TV lighting world, and he started in theater back in the early 80s. And he kind of mentioned that it was almost entirely static lighting. And moving into the automated moving light world was like a big change for him and moving into other genres. What was that technology landscape for you guys when you actually started doing shows, assisting or summer stock? And Jason, why don't you start us off?
When I was doing summer stock, everything, it was whatever equipment that they could get, donated from like the local high school or whatever other theater had closed down. So it was a lot of like really old Fresnels and some Altman 360Qs and a bunch of Kliegels. And that was actually a lot of what we had at purchase at first. And then we got a bunch of Source 4s pretty quickly. I had not had a lot of experience with any real technology. Like we had some scrollers occasionally, and that was kind of like pretty high tech. But there was a point my senior year in high school where we had to move theaters. We weren't our high school theater got shut down because of safety issues, and we had to move our senior show to the junior high school. And they had like no dimmers. I think they had like 24 dimmers or something like that. And we were doing Guys and Dolls. And the other guy who was involved with lighting design there, this guy Kevin Frankenberger and I, we were like, we have to figure out what to do. And we had been doing a lot of research, and we had found out about Vari-Light. And we went down and set a meeting with Lee Magadini and Dan Vinitsky when they were at Vari-Light, and told them what our problem was. And we needed to be able to rent a small number of lights that could take the place of several. So it was completely out of a practical need. It wasn't about moving lights. It wasn't about flashy stuff. It was just about, we needed to get a couple of things that could do all of our specials and all of our backlight. And they helped us out. And they had never rented to a high school before. It was right around the time that they had kind of opened things up and were allowing people to rent things without sending a tech. And so they rented us a handful of lights, and we programmed them lightning. We programmed them on a Microvision FX. I think it was an FX. It might have been even before that. But so everything was like bi-channel. There were no fixtures, and we figured out how to use it. And that, for me, was where I came into how to use the technology. For me, it was like, okay, it's not about all the tricks. It's like, how do I fold this into a workflow that makes sense to create the design that I want to do? And I've kind of held on to that through the years. Everything, every time I choose a fixture or choose something, it has to fit a certain need for the show. It's not just about having, the words that I hate, flash and trash, which unfortunately often get thrown at a lot of the work we all do. All of those decisions are very specifically made for specific reasons, and so to hear flash and trash makes me crazy. But yeah, so that's how I feel about gear and choosing gear, and what my journey has been with the technology.
Great, thanks, Jason. Jeff, how about you?
First of all, Victor. I lived with Victor in the '90s for about 9 months. I love that guy. So he was, I think, I don't know if people talk about him this way, but he's one of the first like theater moving light programmers on an Artisan. One of the best I've worked with. Somehow broke almost every Artisan he touched, I think. I'm kidding. Just a few. I got out of school around that era where people like Victor and the early Vari-Light programmers were changing how theater was designed. In high school, we had a computer board with a brand. I think when I got into high school, it was the first computer board that was purchased for the school. So I learned that was the sort of basis. I learned and understood strand language, which is still the language that we all speak today. I mean, that's what an EOS is based on. So when I graduated, Vari-Lite, as Jason just mentioned, you couldn't just rent Vari-Lites. If you wanted to use Vari-Lites, you had to rent from the company, and it came with a program and it came with text. So the light back then was like, I think the IntelliBeam. I think that's what we were able to rent when it came to a moving light. And it was pretty basic back then. There was, when I got out of school, the Source 4 was just about being invented. I think while I was at City Opera, they were just my first year at City Opera is when they transitioned everything from 360 cues to Source 4, and I think later added some scrollers. But I would say, the VL4 from back then is still one of my favorite color mixing units, and there aren't a lot of lights that do it as well as that VL4 from back then, back in the day. But you sort of build up. I right now I can't imagine doing a show without a moving light. But back then, I remember like begging for 2 on a play in New York and getting like 2 VL5s as little front lights. Or like I remember the first time I could only afford an IQ and a scroller, so stuck like a CXI scroller on the front of the Source 4 with an iris, a DMX iris, and a mirrored light on the front. The craft was horrible, but at least I had a moving special that changed color. And that's where it started.
Interesting.
Well, yeah, not good, but interesting.
John, how about you?
Well, like I said, at my undergraduate, the big space, first of all, it was, like I said, AMX, Data Technology 192. They didn't even know what DMX 512 was yet. And the big space, the space you got to use if you worked hard enough and everything, had the strand light palette 90 in it, which I thought, in the 90s was like hot technology. That just goes to show you how behind the times I was, embarrassingly enough. But before the spaces that I used for like the first 3 years actually had 2 scene and 4 scene preset boards, like a 48 scene preset board. And I was so excited when I got the dance space that actually had the computerized patch on one side of it, because that just like took so much physical time of patching out of the workload. So it was pretty crazy. And then you go all the way forward till today, where like everybody's already hit on, like I couldn't imagine doing a show without moving lights, and especially at the Met, where we do so many performances and so many rehearsals, and time is our biggest enemy. It's just like being able to do that without moving lights actually is the new thing still, but like it's amazing how quickly you forget. Like when I took over as resident lighting designer, it was still kind of like paying 3 light rigs a day every day, and a la carte lighting, and guys hanging off bridges over the top of people. And actually, if they were short a light, you can actually work with them, say, okay, I'm not going to use that light or that channel for the rest of the scene. They would unrig it, move it, and then literally kind of point it in the direction you wanted and put a heavy frost in it, and it'd be good to go. So like I had that type of flexibility, where the idea of moving light was very different for me, even a few years ago. So, I mean, but really, like, I don't know. It's just my approach really hasn't changed to it. Like since I started with just all static fixtures, you have to really sort yourself out. I mean, at the beginning, everybody gets sucked into acting areas, and you need actually every little detail and every angle for every one of your areas. Kind of like that takes time and experience to like build out of, and have the confidence to know that you don't need that equipment. But God, I remember using every available static light in the early days, just in case, and now with moving lights, you don't have to do it. But I think that if I had to do a static light show again, I probably wouldn't have to do that again. But that's, once again, just knowing yourself, knowing how you design. And as Bradley said, knowing what the director wants, knowing the piece. Like, it's really important to know that. Like, once you get that down, the nuts and bolts just kind of fall into place for you. So
Great. Bradley, what do you got to add here?
Not a whole lot. I am ever so slightly younger. So I had I remember the Color Blast had just come out my senior year of college, and that was like a really big deal, like Gen 1 LED stuff. The thing about like my first couple years out of school, I was doing such a huge range of shows because I was doing my own little shows in like basement theaters off Broadway with 4 dimmers from 1962 and a 2-scene preset that I was running myself every night, but also assisting off Broadway and interning on Broadway, where we were getting like the VL 3500 had just come out, which is still in wide use today. So like the thing about theater is like it's really easy to get one of something. It's like when you need the entire system, when you need like 20 of something, when you need 40 of something, like that's when the budget starts to become a real crunch, the way it's not in the television or the concert industry necessarily. So I got a little bit of experience with a huge range of equipment, which was really great early in my career, but I wasn't able to really like use any of it in a meaningful way, or I had to come up with creative ways of using like, what am I going to do with one VL 2000? Like, well, I'm going to put it sort of center and I'm going to put it slightly upstage and it's going to be like a backlight special. And that's sort of how I developed my aesthetic. Or, I'm going to light this show entirely with light bulbs because that's all we can afford. And you know what? I know there are some Fresnels in the basement. We're not going to use them. We're just going to use the light bulbs. And that's how Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812 was born. So, but again, it all comes back to what is the story you're trying to tell? How are you trying to tell it? And what does the piece need? And that dictates your equipment choices, not vice versa.
Interesting. So it's kind of nice. You guys, obviously, we all talk about the transition of moving lights, and Bradley, obviously, for you with the introduction of the first kind of LED fixtures being used. A few of you touched on control and how that's kind of evolved. But what's something that hasn't changed? What's something that's still, obviously, the light bulb, Bradley? But what else maybe hasn't changed since you guys started that's still something you guys use every day? John, why don't you start us off?
Oh, okay. Well, I've thought about this one, and I think that I'll stick to what hasn't been updated, meaning like in the last 10 years. And once again, this is very hard for me because I'm kind of, from a technology standpoint, like research, maybe a bit behind the times compared to my other panelists, because I'm in the seat a lot, like it's just, I don't have a lot of time to like, oh, test this, or we'll drop this by, like all the stuff, we just run out of time. There's changeovers at night. We start at 9 a.m. We finish the performance at 11:30. It starts, and then the night gang starts. So it's just not possible. So I think the one thing I'll add, and I'll stick to one thing and let other people take it from there, is I feel like there is a lack of development in, let's just say, designer interface ideas within lighting consoles. Obviously, lighting consoles are developing at like total fever pitch, visualization, magic sheets, all of these things. But I think there's some basic things that relate to channel use versus like if there was a way for designers to actually set up queries so you could use Flexi Active just for a particular set of cues very quickly, or, because I mean, there are times where, and this kind of relates to my HD lighting design work that I have to do. It is crushingly quick, very stressful. And even having to work across 2 screens sometimes is just too much because it's live and I only have a certain amount of time for that length of the cue to make the changes that the shaders need, that the TV director needs, that the producer wants, that won't hurt the live show. And I think there's just something related to where we, like, each individual designer wants to see different information. And I'll just say that ETC has done a wonderful job providing a lot of it, but I feel like that stopped. And I feel like it stopped a good 6-7 years ago. I mean, and it's because they're like, oh, let's set up magic sheets. Let's do this. Let's do that. And for me, it's just like, that's great. But when I'm doing 219 performances in a season and I'm in charge of 26 productions, and 10 HD broadcasts and 4 concerts, it's usually 40 projects in 32 weeks. I don't have the time, even with 3 assistants. And it would just be great to have that link, some sort of link within the console software to just make it a little bit easier in the moment to see the information you need. So that's my one thing.
Matthias, hopefully you're taking notes.
Yeah, actually, it's also true in the concerts and TV. TV, you have the same, and you mentioned it on the HD broadcast. So the getting to information very, very fast is definitely an issue. And there's so many channels now. Like you talk about 2 preset, consoles. You talk about 4 dimmers. Now, a show with 40 universes is like not really big anymore if you look at a lot of TV shows out there. So drilling down to specific information is actually really a challenge. It's a challenge on the UI. It's a challenge on the computer power that you have. So it's not quite as easy, but there's definitely, I agree, like everything is like exploding around us, and we're actually lacking ways to really interact with it and really know quickly what is going on. So I know that that's something we'll have to address on the console side from all manufacturers. That's a really good point.
Great. Jason, what hasn't changed? Technology.
The big one that I think I hit on the other day when we were talking about this is follow spots. I know a lot of people are making follow spots. I know a lot of manufacturers are trying to evolve follow spots, but I've yet to see a new follow spot that I feel like has the power, the color, temperature, the dexterity, the control, and I know a lot of people are getting I don't want to say sidelined, but they're focusing on the idea of remote follow spots and all of that. And I think that's one thing that is interesting and helpful and has its own place. But I think the technology of the follow spot that is still run by a person and has a human touch to it is something that we really need to get a little bit of a leg up on, because every time, every show, every throw, I'm always struggling with what to use that's going to fit the bill and be maintainable and look good and be something that's runnable for 8 shows a week. So I think that's a big one for me.
Great. I think that was brought up in one of the other webinars we did with the festival guys. Follow spots is a big topic in the industry. Jeff.
Yeah. Hi. I will say 5K style big bright wash fixtures, both in a moving light like a VL 3500 wash type fixture, and even non-fixed that changes color. There is not that I've seen yet. I haven't seen it yet. Maybe it's out there somewhere. No one's put it in front of my eyes. A great wash replacement for the VL 3500. And cyc lighting, same idea. Like there's a lot of graze cyc fixtures. I haven't come in contact with a lot of wash cyc fixtures that are a far cyc replacement that do really well. I will say, you said, John, you said that the light bulb hasn't changed, but it actually has. There's LED light bulbs that change color that still for some reason is hard to grasp. For some reason, it's they're not out there enough. It's not easy to find just a light bulb that has a color changer in it. They're there, but it's not as cheap as you think it would be.
Yeah, scalability in that would be something.
Yeah. And in terms of console, John, ETC. It's funny you said the ETC hasn't updated that in years, but it's in there, and they're not maybe so great about telling people what they. Not that I need to advocate for ETC; they do a great job, but it actually does do an awful lot, and it's customizable. It's deep within it sometimes, but they've made some great strides. And I will say that they're very receptive. And there was a time last year when I was with them looking at a console, and I said, "What about this thing I asked for 4 years ago?" And they said, "We did it 3 years ago." And I'm like, "Oh, great, okay." So there's a lot in there that maybe we all don't know about.
So ETC, if you're listening, tell these guys that you're implementing what they've asked you to do.
They tell the programmers all know. And I feel like as a designer, there are things that console does that I learned from my programmer. I'll say something and I look at how they're doing it, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was like, I didn't know that they made that so easy, because they do. They listen to us, and that's what's great about the EOS system, is that they do listen
Jason,
to us.
Yeah, can I add something to this conversation? Because I've had this conversation with ETC and with a lot of other manufacturers. And John, you mentioned like the scale of the work that we do and the scale of the work that we all do. And something that I've found interesting is, as we're talking about with the manufacturers all of this new technology and how to integrate it, there's also a moment in every one of those conversations where everybody goes, "Whoa, we're actually a really small part of their market." Like, when you look at, churches and schools and all of the installation,
totally,
all of the things. And I remember having this conversation way back when we were first doing Rock of Ages, when we were first moving to Broadway. And there were very specific things. It was one of the early shows where we were asking the EOS to do the entire system rather than having a moving light console and a conventional console. And there were some really specific things that we wanted to get done, and we weren't able to get them done because they were in the midst of rolling out, I don't remember if it was the Element or something like that. So everybody was focused on that. And I was like, okay, but we're Broadway, like and it's like, in that moment we had a very frank conversation of like, okay, but like, there's something you have to understand about the market when you're asking for those things. And it really put a little twist now whenever I do have that conversation. It's like, okay, how do we have this conversation where I make sure that we understand that this is something that's good for everybody if I'm asking for it, not just I need what I need right now. Although there are so many times where we all feel that way. It just like, as we've been talking about that conversation, it reminded me of that conversation.
Great. Bradley, we didn't forget about you. What technology really hasn't changed?
I'm going to keep it short. No one has improved or will improve ever, I think, on Roscoe Frost. It's perfect. Doesn't need to be changed. Just keep rolling it out. It does exactly what I need it to do.
Except they changed it. They changed those.
I know.
It's not as good.
I'm the pre-2007 batch or whatever.
Because it was killing people who made it, which I get is a problem, but it's not as good.
It's not, but it's good enough.
You're right, though. Yeah.
And I do take issue. I think the light bulb. I'm going to come back to the light bulb because there is no good replacement for an incandescent light bulb right now. Specifically, when you take that incandescent light bulb down to like 8% and you get the red shifted glowing filament, you can show me as many LED filaments in clear glass bulbs as you want. No one has gotten the curve right, the color temperature shift right, and the filament glow right to a place where I can reasonably substitute it in for a bare glass bulb. And if anyone's seen Hadestown, we have like 1 million little Part 38 lamps all over that walls, and they played most of Act 2 at around 12%. And I know the tour's coming up. I know we're going to have to talk about moving it to LED because you can't tour with that many glass bulbs in the back of a truck. But I'm dreading that conversation because I know when I take that down on dimmer, it's not going to redshift the way it should. It's going to go to that like gross brown color. So manufacturers, that's what I really want.
Matthias, get to work on that, please.
No brown. I wrote that down. It's actually Jason's feedback there is quite good because as a manufacturer, we definitely have to design for a very wide market, and it goes both ways. You are able to use certain products because the market is big outside of your territory, and it allows us to make products, like Monet, Rembrandt would be good examples that are usable in a very wide range. And, the scale of the market that is out there then allows these products and also really perform well in a Broadway opera theater market. And to Jeff, like we do try, to make products that sort of replace some of these workhorse fixtures. I've done quite a big effort to make products that are not flash and trash, as Jason likes to call it, but actually make quite, refined instruments that are really, that should feel familiar, I think, and that we feel, can be utilized where you previously had, maybe a static instrument or an older technology. But that is only possible because the market around it is so big. It's corporate, it's trade shows, it's television and concerts, and all that drives the development a lot, honestly, more than Broadway does, for sure. There's no denying that. But I think you also then end up with some really amazing, fixtures ultimately. And, we always try to build these, and all manufacturers do that. We try to build them in a way that they're universally usable by a large mega church as much as by a Broadway play. And that's how these, fixtures are affordable to everyone somewhat, hopefully.
Well, thanks, Matthias, for that insight. As you guys have obviously noticed, we are over the Elation Hour, but we're not going to cut it off. We've got a great group of guys, and we have a really good conversation going. So we're going to continue on a little bit. We've talked about some of the technology as you've gotten in. We've talked about some things that haven't changed, some things that have changed. Let's talk about some techniques. Certainly as this toolkit has expanded, are there specific techniques that you guys are using, whether it be a set of color palettes or the Roscoe Frost or fixture groupings of a specific type that, you guys have built your aesthetic around and that may be signature looks for you guys? Bradley, why don't you start us?
I would hope that I don't have a signature look. I think it's a little hard to tell, like, from the inside whether or not that's true, or like whether I have like a quote unquote style, because what I want to believe is that I'm making all of those equipment choices and I'm making all of those color choices in service of a story. And just as every story isn't the same and requires a different set of tools, like lighting is storytelling. So the tools I use to tell those stories should vary per the play, per the musical, whatever the event is. Having said that, yes, so I do a lot of work with Rachel Chavkin, the director, and Rachel has one of the reasons I love working with her is because her sense of lighting is so mature, it's pronounced. She has a really strong grasp of what she wants out of it, and she uses it very kinetically. So that leads me to pick certain fixtures when working with her that I wouldn't in other circumstances. I need lights that are fast, that are responsive, that are punchy. And because she and I have developed a sort of common language or a shorthand, like you do with any collaborator over a long period of time, I know there are certain things that she's going to want just in the toolkit. I know she's going to want big, powerful, punchy backlight for a musical. So my Rachel Chavkin plots are very heavy upstage and very light front of house because it's backlight and follow spots. That's pretty much all a Rachel Chavkin show is. And then, everything else, color, I come from the Yale via NYU school, which is all shades of white. My palettes tend to be a bit more restrained. I don't feel like I use color very well, which scares me off of it. But I love shades of white. I love color temperature. So, a lot of the plots I put together make use of, tungsten versus arc versus LED. I love, sort of playing against just the natural color temperatures of those elements. And that's also why I'm so anxious to get a real, tungsten replacement, because I know that there's going to be a day when I can't buy that bulb anymore and I don't know what I'm going to do. But I think it's important to hammer home that, the style and the toolkit should be in service of the story you're trying to tell, and not trying to force a particular technique or style onto the story.
Great. Jeff, how about you? Unfortunately, you're muted, sir.
Yes, sorry. Having sound problems today. Can you repeat the question? I think, do you want to make sure I have the thread still right?
As the technology toolkit is obviously evolved, let's talk a little about technique. Do you have a specific fixture grouping pattern that you use, color palettes, tool specific to your look, your aesthetic?
So this will be a fast answer. No, I do not have a specific toolkit. It's everything we do is different. Every time we walk into a room to do a show, it's a different theater, different set, different costumes, different actors. People are standing in different places. So the show, as Bradley just said, the show kind of dictates that, but the scenery dictates it. The story, the approach, the concept is, it's all dictated by that. When I read a play, I have an idea of what direction I want to go with equipment, but I don't have any go-to. I like versatility, like all of us do. I like the flexibility, so I love moving lights. I happen to love using color and love working with color, and I like playing like clear light against color. So I love that we have so much availability right now with fixtures that can do that. It can change color. There, we'll get out of here a little faster.
Thank you, Jeff. Mr. Froelich.
Well, being pretty much, other than the very rare periods of time, being tied to one theater is probably what my fellow panelists might be called a blessing, and sometimes I call a curse, and it goes back and forth. So I would say that even within that, though, in my job, I have to constantly change hats between being communicator or facilitator between director and designer, and sometimes helping designer develop ideas, trying to guide the designer to make sure that they can get a monumental task in an absolutely crushingly minimal amount of time, and also remind them that it's a 4,000 seat house. So, I mean, the one thing that I would say probably doesn't change at the Met right now, and it has a couple of factors to do with, the taste of the producer right now and everything like that. But follow spots are used in every show. And it's an important thing because, once again, anybody sat in the family circle, which is the high seats at the Met, you are really far away. And I try to keep in mind and keep it really, really at the top of the important ideas stack as everybody's creating, that people need to be seen. Now, within that, we've worked really hard with changing how we follow spot at the Met, and also the creative process. Like when I first started off as resident designer, there were programmers, but they were, kind of treated like board ops, and there were follow spot operators, but they weren't treated as a team. And I think, not to call people as part of your toolkit, but you're only as good as how you treat the people around you. And I've worked really hard with the leads of those little mini departments within the electrics department to know that they're kind of part of the creative team. Like, they need to be able to apply what they do, their craft, in the most artistic way possible. And that with the crushing, once again, crushing deadlines and timelines and how little time. I mean, an opera is usually designed in probably under 60 hours at the Met, and it doesn't matter how long it is. And so we need everybody to be contributing and listening to me, listening to a visiting designer, and applying and being bold and having the trust. So I think that's one thing, follow spots that won't change, and then that toolkit. But within that, everything else pretty much changes. So
awesome. Jason, anything that's signature to you?
I mean, I feel like I like to try to change it up, just as Bradley and Jeff were talking about, that, it all depends on the show. It depends on what the script is asking for, what the director's looking for, what the aesthetic of the piece is. I feel like all of that is, I like to try to tune in per show. The one thing that I feel like I've done more and more over the years as a technique that's kind of on the back end of things is a little bit of what I was talking about with the follow spots before too, is like I spend a lot of time trying to make sure that whatever design choices that I'm making are able to be sustained over the course of 8 shows a week. That I really try to spend a lot of time getting into the maintenance issues and the everyday stuff that I'm normally not there for once we leave, to make sure that the people in the room who are working so hard to deliver the show are able to deliver my vision properly without, crazy issues. I remember years ago when I was working as an associate with McDevitt, we did a musical, and we were like the first show to use whatever the new hot moving light was that year, and I won't mention it. But throughout the entire 2 years of that run, the electrician called me probably 3 times a week, bitching me out about the choice of fixture. And bitching me out about I know it was fun and I know it did the cool things that you wanted to do, but it will not do it every show. So every other show looks terrible. And then we're able to take it apart and fix it and go in with a soldering iron because that's what we have to do to fix it. And then it's back for a couple of shows. So I started taking that really personally and wanting to try to include that into my workflow as a designer to help show that respect that, I know to get what I want, I need to be able to give the folks who are doing the hard work every day what they need to get the job done too.
Interesting. I sort of like this concept that all of you have a changing aesthetic to a degree. And obviously you each have your own proclivities, but the techniques that you really employ are about execution of the show and workflow and creating those environments that are repeatable. It's pretty amazing. Kind of jumping back to technology a little bit. I mean, obviously, as things have progressed and moving lights have come in and LEDs and advancements in control solutions, I think one thing that theater has really kind of lagged behind some of the other genres is adoption of this new technology. Can you guys give us some insight into why do you think that is? I mean, I think from my perspective, some of it has to do with maybe, we know what this is, we like what this is, we work around what this is without even thinking about it, so we stick with it. But I think after we prepped, you guys had some other ideas there. So Jeff, why don't you start us off with that? Unfortunately, you're muted again. Sorry,
I keep hitting the thing and it doesn't. Do you mean how we use the technology or how? Or
well, it's just a level of adoption. Theater seems to not take on moving lights as quickly, or LEDs as quickly, or the adoption level is slower, it lags behind. And is that a comfort level, or is that?
I think it's money. I mean, it's money and it's time and it's money. And, theater seems to be a trickle down industry. If a large concert tour or a big TV production wants something, they'll get it. And that's not just purchasing, that's R&D. They TV lighting designers and concert lighting designers who have shops, like the lighting designer has a shop where they're actively working on creating products that they will use in an upcoming show. And I don't have the time for that. No one's paying me to do that. I don't have the money for that. So it's not that we don't have the interest or the skill. I just don't think that the money's there. And in terms of, what we get, I mean, I think part of what's in the, John, you've heard me, every manufacturer of a piece of lighting equipment has heard me say this over and over again. We're at the mercy of what we can rent for the most part in the theater business. When I started working with Penn and Teller in Vegas, I was open up to a whole different aspect of the world of lighting, which just to piggyback on something Jason said earlier, it does make us as me as a theater designer, seem so small because we are not a very big part of this market at all. And for Penn and Teller, for anything I've done in Vegas, they don't rent. They don't rent anything. It's all purchasing, and so I have a little bit more power to get what I want. They don't even rent sidearms in Vegas. I mean, everything I needed had to be bought and brought into the room. So I think, I guess that's the difference. It's just harder. It's harder to ask for something, knowing that they're not going to buy it for you. And I will say, I did a show recently. I went for Freestyle of Supreme. They bought fixtures for us, and I spec'd something that I thought the shop had, and it turns out they didn't have it. When I found out that they didn't have it and they were buying it, I called them and I said, well, if you're buying it anyway, can I spec something? And they said, no, this is what we've committed to. This is the fixture we're buying. So this is what we'll be using. And that was sort of that.
Interesting.
I have another, I think we'll get to this later, but there's something else about like choosing equipment, but
Absolutely.
Go on. Let's move on.
John, I know there's some things that you said, some things just always stay the same, particularly at the Met. So what do you attribute that trail and adoption? And obviously you guys just went through a big redo for the first time in many, many years. So.
Oh yeah, it's been an interesting year. I mean, before COVID. So, yeah, I would just kind of reinforce what everybody's already said, that obviously it's different for me because I'm at the Met, but really things were very slow for change at the Met. And obviously everybody would think it's because, and it rightfully so, we're 138 production repertory opera company. And there is about 6 weeks of downtime every fiscal year. And those 6 weeks are made basically available so that the stagehands can rip the theater apart and keep vital systems running. And I mean, we're going through a huge renovation right now, and people are doing these Herculean things that are absolutely amazing. And like Local One, my hat's off to you for everything you're doing. And it's funny though that we have original rigging systems from 1966 in the building still functioning, so it is slow. The major motivator behind the time is the money. Like, even though the Met is a multi-$100 million institution annually, we don't have money. Like, it's just not the money. And then if you do find money, it's like all of a sudden we found the money, like talk about. And it's kind of like what Jeff said with speccing that equipment, and all of a sudden a decision's made or there's not enough time and everybody's scared to do it. Like you said, we just kind of bit the bullet and really ripped everything apart over the last year. But it's something that I've been creating in my mind for the last 7-8 years and talking with people about. And it's not just my idea. It's the lighting programmers, it's the electricians, it's the Local One focus assistants that deal with the rotation of the building. It's like a cumulative idea and effort to get that done. And like I said, it might have just been started this year, but it's been in the making for a long time. And so it's just hard to make the changes in theaters that just can't slow down, because if they slow down, they're not making money. And we've already touched on this before. It's just not money. The margins are so small that, it's just hard to make those huge, bold changes, so.
All right. Budget once again. Bradley, what's your perspective there?
It's budget. It's, as Jeff said, theaters, when you're working in theater, and especially when you're working in commercial theater in New York, you're not buying anything, you're renting it all. You're at the total mercy of one of 3 shops, usually one of 2. And I will say that while theater doesn't get anything new, usually, with some rare exceptions, like the Encore was laser targeted at the theater market and laser priced at the theater market. And I think was built with the input of a huge number of theater designers. And that's why it was adopted so quickly, or one of the reasons why it was adopted so quickly. But, we are getting the cast offs, but we're also sort of like, we're getting the filtered stuff. Like, we're not getting the thing that's 3 weeks off the assembly line, but we're also not getting the thing that's 3 weeks off the assembly line that doesn't work. Like, the fixtures we are getting have sort of proven their mettle in the open market a lot, which is something I appreciate. But, especially with the adoption of LEDs, these manufacturers are rolling out products so quickly that no shop is going to, isn't going to take the time to make a major investment in a manufacturer that's rolling out a new version 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 every 3 months, which I know Elation is not doing. I'm speaking about others, but I think that that's one of the reasons that we're not getting the newest stuff, because a lot of times, like, it's not great to have the newest stuff. You want to see what let someone else break their show with it first, and we also have we have very specific needs in terms of color rendering, in terms of the quality of light that we need on people. because we're not just doing air effects stuff. There's a lot of skin tones that need to be considered. So it's all of these things compounded with the fact that we're working at 1% of the budget of everyone else. So
that's great insight, Bradley. Thank you, Jason. I know you use a lot of different things. I mean, we've worked on a lot of those new toys and different things, but what do you think?
I mean, I try. I like to play, and I like to I mean, I wouldn't necessarily like have a new fixture as the workhorse for a show, but I would definitely play with something. But I think the big question with how theater evolves technology-wise, I mean, we've all hit on the money, the availability, the time, but there's a lot of it that's personality too. I always, when I talk about this, I always go back to when the Source 4 came out. And the Source 4 came out and everybody freaked out. They were like, it's too cold, the field is too flat, there's no way that this is going to be the replacement for the 360Q or whatever other fixture people were using at the time. And they just lost their minds over it. Cut to 20 years later, 30 years later, and everybody is looking for every light fixture, whether it's a moving light, whether it's an LED, any other fixture, it has to match a Source 4. Like every time you go into a demo, they're like, and this is what it looks like with a Source 4. Like it's just absolutely insane. And that's just, it's taken that long for people to kind of go through this evolution of accepting that as the new fixture. How we see light has completely changed in the last 20 years. When I first moved to New York, you would walk through Times Square and there were a couple of screens, but it was mostly a lot of neon and sodium vapor, and it was still somewhat dark. If you walked one avenue over onto 8th Avenue, it would be dark. And then they started adding all the LED screens, and now it's daylight all the way to the river. And it's up to us, because people are now walking through that and then stepping into a Broadway theater. There's a whole different concept of what bright is, of what color is. Like when that's our baseline, we have to work against that. So that's how I think that we've now kind of come around and are understanding how to fight that, but it's taken a long time for theater designers in general to kind of wrap their heads around that context. We were all in our little bubble where we understood exactly what the color temperature means, but the second you have the context of the rest of the world, it changes.
Interesting.
Would you think that the upcoming generation will light differently because they're so used to different instruments that they may never miss a certain character of older instruments that, were popular 20 years ago?
I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, just in the last 10 years of how monitors have changed. We're having light shine directly into our eyes constantly in a way that we hadn't before. So I think that there's a different understanding, and our brains are kind of adjusting to how we see that stuff. And I think that will affect how we light things. I think it affects, in the same way that like the kineticism of MTV changed how everything happened after that. Right. All of a sudden we could, to sit still in a moment was a lot more difficult to do. Everybody felt like it needed to have all the stuff. So I think that there's a level of that, in our zeitgeist that gets rolled in as we go.
Interesting. Well, for the sake of time, since we're now at 24 minutes over the hour, I'm going to combine sort of two questions together and kind of close this out, if you guys are good with that. And we sort of all touched on budgets and, your vendor and what's on the shelf. So let's talk about vendor relationships. And then, of course, as Bradley mentioned, when you're in Broadway, it's one of three, maybe two companies that you're really navigating through. So why don't we talk about specification versus what you're receiving, and then the vendor relationship kind of as a one topic scenario. And Jeff, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, so this is actually what I was going to say before. When we were putting together Freestyle Love Supreme, we, I think I also mentioned this as I go through a project and as I think about the project, I kind of think about what kind of light I want to use. Not necessarily the brand, but sometimes even the specific brand. And I had an idea of what I wanted to use for that show as sort of the workhorse, and couldn't get it, and was invited by a rental shop to come over and see what they had. And they put, I think, 8 lights in a demo room. And, I actually brought our programmer. Programmer and I sat there and spent, hours just looking at what all the lights could do, and just to make sure that they would do what we needed them to do. And we picked something, and the next day I got a text from the programmer saying, I think it'll work, but just so you know, I spoke to someone else who said it's a nightmare to maintain, something about it exploding or something like that. And I actually called the manufacturer and I said, does your light explode? And they said, oh no, the first version does, but the one that the shops have now doesn't explode anymore. I was like, okay, great. But to Elation and anyone else who makes a moving light, well, I guess it doesn't matter so much anymore because no one uses lamps. But this light, to something Jason was saying before, it was unmaintainable because you couldn't change the lamp with the light in the air. You had to take it down and replace it with another fixture and spend hours changing the lamp. So we ended up sending them back to the shop. So, the answer to the question would, do I get to spec gear? Do I use what's on the shelf? Yes, 90% of the time I'm using what's on the shelf in a shop. And I do have a relationship with shops. I have a purchase relationship and I have a rental relationship, and they're very different. There's a place that I go to buy equipment, and I don't know how this worked out. It just sort of did. It's not the place I rent equipment from. The relationships I have, and I rent from all of the companies in New York. The relationships go back 25 years, and it just has to do with who I feel will take care of a show specifically, and who the right shop for the show is. Also, I guess one of the first things I do, not so much the first thing I do after I get hired, but before, while I'm doing a light plot and having a production meeting, maybe at the end of the first production meeting, I'll pull either the producer, the general manager, or the production manager aside, and I always ask them if they have a preference as to what shop they want to go to. Sometimes they do, and so if they want to go to a certain place, if they have a preference, I'm not going to waste a favor, or I'm not going to, I'd much rather come from someone else than me if there is that relationship in place.
Great. Jason, I think you probably have some insight onto that exact piece of that equation.
I have some insight. I find it interesting because so much of our choices, as we've already said, end up being dictated by the shop that we end up using, and some relationships have been developed in ways that when you do want something new, you're able to get it. And other times you can't, and it, I feel like for the shops, they have to look at it as an investment, and are they willing to spend a larger amount of money on a show? How do they feel about the show? How do they feel about the prospects of the show? As well as the relationship with the designers. And I feel like we have to take that seriously too. Like I don't feel like I can ask a shop to spend a lot of money buying new equipment on something that I don't know is going to run. Not that we know anything is going to run, but that I don't have the confidence that it's going to be something that will be worth their while. Whereas if I feel like it's something that's worth their while, I will fight for it. If I feel like if I feel like the equipment is going to serve the show and make the show better, then I will. I'll do what I can to fight for that. And sometimes that includes fighting for a specific shop. I mean, as Jeff said, I always try to have that conversation at the beginning too. Like, do they have a preference? Does the general manager or producer have a preference? And I might say to them, like, I'm happy to bid everything out, but I want to make sure that you understand that when I'm making these very specific choices, if there are some choices that are whether they're pushed aside or whatever, then I might fight for this. This is something that I might come back to you about because of all of the reasons we've talked about with equipment. Is I don't want to be put in a situation where I'm doing a show and I've had my legs cut out from under me because of a shop choice, that I can't serve the needs of the show because of a shop choice, having nothing to do with money. Well, if across the board, if the bids came back and everything was even, I would want to make the proper choice for the show. And when you hire me as the lighting designer, you're hiring me as the person who's going to decide what those choices are.
Great. Bradley, any insight there?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Jason and Jeff, in the same way that I think, your story dictates your equipment choices, your equipment dictates your shop choices. And so I try and be vendor agnostic in terms of I'm not going to force the process into a particular shop. And certain shows need certain pieces of equipment, and certain shops have those certain pieces of equipment and others don't. And that will, generally inform which way I try and steer the process. But also, especially working on Broadway, we have a duty as, or not just a duty, but we should have the desire to have our show run as long as possible. It's in everyone's best interest. And so we can't we can't forgo the responsibility to make fiscally sound choices about the weekly running costs, about the maintenance costs, about the purchase costs. Yes, if you're working on a high profile enough show, you can generally convince the shop to buy you something. But then if it's something they've already got 60 of the shelf and you just need 40 more, that's one thing. If you're asking them to add an entirely new product to their line, they're going to charge you the entire amount up front for it, because what are they going to do with 20 of these things that, they now have to maintain and, or sell back, or, it's as Jason and Jeff said, it's like an investment on their part. So, I think that's something that I try and keep in mind as the business side of things. And, I need a really good reason to say, no, it absolutely has to be this particular light. And it can't be anything else. Because I do have an obligation to the show, to the producers, to make sure that we run a long time. And I want to see the show run a long time. I want to see tours launched. I want to see more opportunities for people to spend money and buy things, not less.
Absolutely. And John, obviously your perspective is going to be a little different on this, vendor relationship wise and specification, but obviously it's just going from a repertoire or to a repertory plot from a rental scenario. Maybe you can give us some insight there.
Yeah, sure. Like I said, I've kind of total different kettle of fish compared to what my fellow panelists go through on a production by production basis. The Met owns their equipment, and there are certain times within a season, obviously, where then we need to supplement that equipment to just get through the heavy rotation of, sometimes there's 20 special electrics hanging in the air, and we can't strip each one of them down to move one. There's really only 5 or 6 in operation, but we don't have the time to strip them all apart, move them, and then and like I said, there's amazing people doing all of that rotation for me when I thank them in my mind every day. But something has changed recently where over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've been successful with a small group of people at the Met to change their approach to how they purchase equipment, and actually about how we light shows. We've gone to a completely full moving light rig. We've taken out all the manned overhead lighting bridges. And that was a huge research project over the last 3 years. And the way that I tried to approach it, because I went from not knowing very much at all about vendor relationships and how this stuff works to then all of a sudden, hey, have over $1 million in my pocket and I'm ready to go and I need to do it now, And I felt like there was a huge responsibility there to include as many voices as I could. And some people said I did it right. Some people say I did it wrong. But what I tried to do was get all of the electricians at the Met, as many of the designers that visit the Met, and also the opinions of some people who might design there someday. Be like, hey, I've whittled it down to these 4 pieces of equipment and these 3 pieces of equipment, and get their input, get their insight. And then I made that decision. We went with the Elation Monet profile, and we were going to supplement that with washes. But then after looking at that as well and talking with everybody who's been working at the Met over the last season, made the decision to keep an all profile rig. And then there's linear arrays of chorus line STs that Matthias modified especially to make the theater version. And it's been going really well. But to talk about vendor relationships, I realized that now we're going to be doing this about every 7 years. And it's important to me to talk with, like Bradley said, stay, vendor and manufacturer agnostic, and talk with other designers, see what they want to use, see their successes, see their failures, and take all of that. It's almost like a collaboration in and of itself that has to happen along with everything else that, the Met team does together. But pretty soon, I think we might have a little bit more input on what vendors buy as well, because it's like, now we have Elation Monets, and someday that might change. But right now I want to supplement the rig, and the visiting lighting designers want to supplement that rig with that same piece of equipment to keep systems similar, to keep everything similar. So it's, for me, it's just more about being completely open, being collaborative, willing to kind of the balance that we're talking about that maybe we didn't hit on as much, but we've always been worried about keeping shows as reliable. I can't go and buy BL 3500 profiles, even though they're probably, in my mind, one of the most reliable moving lights that's ever been made. We have to move forward a bit, but we also have to keep an eye on what's stable, what's reliable, and also to listen to all the vendors and all the manufacturers and keep it open, keep the field big. That's what innovation. That's where innovation comes from, And it was a hard process, and at times it got a little cutting, but that was the road, and that's going to happen every 7 years. So guys, keep me in the loop. I need the input. So.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end for today. Thank you guys very, very much for taking the extra time with us today. Jeff, thank you very much. Jason,
sure, you're welcome.
Appreciate you.
It's great. It's nice to see you guys.
To Bradley.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, so great to hang out with you guys. Thanks.
Of course, Matthias, thank you for your insight, my friend.
Yeah, thanks to this great panel. Really appreciated this. It was great.
Well, as I mentioned, thank you all for taking this extra time with us today. Obviously, there's more to talk about with these gentlemen. Maybe we can do a follow-up at some point. But tune in next week for another Tools and Techniques edition of the Elation Hour. Hopefully, we can keep it to an hour this time. And we'll have trade show corporate events and special events. And we'll be joined by John Featherstone, Chris Medvitz, and Ignacio Rosenberg from Light Switch. Thank you all, and have a great week.